All right, we're live.
We're live.
Hello, reader friends.
Hi, everybody.
Awesome.
Hello.
All right, I'm gonna tweet us out.
Yeah. Welcome to our long-awaited. Well, we've just been anticipating so much discussion of Tyranny of Kindness by Theresa Funiciello. Teresa, is that how you say your last name? We've been saying it this whole month.
Yeah.
Really?
So how do you say your last name then?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you're actually asking me. I say Funiciello because, well, it's a long story. You wouldn't know. There wasn't Annette, and she was on television when I was a kid, and she was a kid, and I had to change the way my name was pronounced, so that because people just called me that.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So we were pretty good, and with Scott Santens. So guess who the surprise guest was?
Should I tweet it? Should I tell people now?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
This is our first time, by the way, actually speaking to an author of our reading. So we're very honored that you are here and that Scott is also here. So for this month, we tried to focus in on universal basic income. So we of course approached Scott and we're like, hey, we need your help here. So Megan and I are not UBI experts by any means.
No.
So we're along with everyone else here trying to learn more about it, do our part as proper Yang Gang people. And so, but the book you chose, Scott, is this, and I'll read the subtitle. It's called Dismantling the Welfare System to End Poverty in America. So it's not like there are books about UBI, right? Yeah. This book more so focuses on welfare, and Teresa, your experience at one point being on welfare, being a single mom on welfare, and then becoming an advocate. So before we get in like too much into the book though, could you guys both, introduce yourselves just, in case anyone here needs an introduction, and kind of talk to just about the book or about, your work with the topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just say that I've been focused on the topic of basic income since 2013, and it was interesting. One of the I came at this from the automation perspective, and I was thinking about the future of work and these kinds of things, and then I started studying the history and the evidence behind basic income, and then along the way, like one of the really transformative moments for me along the way was listening to Diane Pagan give a presentation at I think it was the 2014 or 2015 U.S. Big Congress, and it was all about TANF, and it was one of those things where I hadn't really dug into TANF, and then learning more about it, I remember just kind of like boiling in my seat, just getting so angry about how this system works. And so then that kind of began my exploring of okay, what is the existing welfare system? How does that work? How do the different programs work? What are the real details involved? And once you do that and dig in, then it just is just that much more reasoning for a basic income. And it's just there's just so many different perspectives and reasons why it's important. But I think that was an extremely important one. And so Diane recommended that I read Teresa's book. And yeah, when I read the book, and I was just like this just nails just how how people are suffering in the system, and how the unconditionality and the conditions we apply, what we make people do, especially women essentially do for this income, is damaging, and we think that everybody's getting this and it doesn't. And I think that just to touch upon the book a little bit, I don't want to get into too much yet, but the book starts out and Teresa describes this history of a woman who is Muslim, and she was essentially committing a murder-suicide of her family. And it was because of basically this idea of like, okay, what is my future going to be like? And, you know, I'm going to have to either like sell my body for income, and I can't do that because of my beliefs, and my kids are going to be worse off. And then there's like the welfare, and what happens if you know, is that going to help? And just like, you can imagine being in that position, and her solution was basically to end the lives of her family and herself to avoid this. And it's like, people have no idea that that's really how bad things can be, and we need to change that. And so I think it really frames the book well to start off there and to dig in to Teresa's experience and stuff. And again, I'm so happy that you wrote the book, and it's just it's one of those things where I feel that if more people read the book, then we'd already have a basic income. It's just it's just way underread, and it's too underappreciated. It's so powerful.
Thank you. I mean, you all know what my story is. So any questions anybody has, you should ask. But I do appreciate, Scott, that you got in touch with me with this.
Yeah. Well, so I was wondering if you could speak, Teresa, if you could just speak to like, having since written and published the book. So this was 93, fun fact, Megan and I were born in 93.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Very,
that's very fitting.
We felt so. We were like,
I was like, oh, perfect. Nothing has changed.
Not much, no.
Nothing changed.
Not much has changed. The welfare system is as miserable as ever. In fact, it got worse after the book was published, because President Clinton, decided that he could get reelected by producing something that he called welfare reform, and most welfare mothers ultimately called welfare deform. And what it did was it made matters 10 times worse. It took the income portion of welfare out of the program, essentially, handed a bunch of money over to states and says, if you feel like giving some away to poor people, you're free to, but you're also free to give to anybody you feel like giving it to. And there was no requirement, which had existed in the welfare system that I lived on. And so as a consequence of that, in the actual incomes that women live on with their children, which it's most programs are just women and children, are half what they used to be. So you read that book and you see that those numbers and how pathetic they seem, and they are worse now. That's the main thing that I think about right now. I had to look at the book, and it really upset me again.
Yeah, I think one of the points you make in the book that I really want people to recognize, because I think it's such a strong point, is to point out how effectively there are two different systems, especially if you're looking for women with children. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if your husband leaves you, then you can go the TANF route and food stamps route, and it's all conditional. But if your husband happens to die, then you're a widow, and then suddenly it's an entirely different system, and you just have this secure floor of Social Security, and there's no work conditions, and there's no stigma attached, and nobody is thinking about like anything that they apply to their system. It's totally different. And so I like the I don't remember the exact line that you said, but you made a joke about how if you think that that's going to happen, just go ahead and kill your husband.
Yeah. If you think he's going to leave you, shoot him.
Right.
Yes.
Who said that?
I'm telling you, though, I will say, like, one of the things I really enjoyed throughout the book was your snark. I love snark. And I even tweeted about it. I was like, this book is really good. And it's so much information. And so sometimes you're like, oh, this is so much information. And then you throw in a line like that and you're like, oh my gosh.
Well, I tried to make it as readable as possible. And yet, there was so much material that had to be gone over and before I could come to a conclusion, it seemed.
Yeah.
The book gets bogged down.
Right.
Yeah, it's a heavy read because there's such suffering involved in an understanding and of how these systems work. And like I remember one of the parts from the book too that just kind of kicked me in the chest was the one where it's a good description too of how this woman had essentially free housing. And so like a lot of progressives will be like, oh, just give free housing and it'll be fine. But so she had the free housing, but of course she had a slumlord and she didn't have any money. And so there was no heat. And so she went to bed with her kids and woke up and her youngest was dead in the bed. And, she wasn't able to, if she just had some money, then she could have gone out and bought some blankets. She could have, done something to get some heat in there. But instead she had nothing except for this place to sleep. And she had hoped that by cuddling up and being close at night, they could survive that night. And it didn't happen. And so it's just heartbreaking to see like real examples like that of people literally dying of poverty. And I think that's something that people don't understand. Like, yes, people die of poverty in the US.
Yeah.
People die of poverty more than any other single cause of death. And if you examine the vital statistics against things like neighborhoods where poor people live, they die of everything more often than anyone else. They die in fire 6 times more often than people who are not poor. They die in every form of conceivable disease more often. And particularly there are lots of children who freeze to death, and that's never mentioned anywhere. You just, once in a while, someone writes an article about it in the paper. This is not something that's gone from 40 years ago. This is today. It exists. Any winter, you'll see this happen.
Like coroners are not filling out the reports saying death by poverty. There's all sorts of other reasons why, but it actually is poverty, but we don't recognize that because it's not actually like on their death certificate. It's not really there. And so like when we have it's important that people understand that right now in this country, 13 million people in poverty are living with no federal assistance whatsoever. They have fallen through our conditional safety net there's many different reasons why that happens, but it's happening and it's real. And I think that, anyone who calls themselves a progressive should care about that and be wondering, okay, how do we make sure that no one falls through? That we cannot accept that 13 million people in poverty are getting nothing. How do we lift everybody up? And so, what I liked about your book too is that not only you gain the understanding, especially let's say the first 2/3 of the book. Like the first third of the book is like really looking at the system as it exists, and there's just real stories that just really stick with you to understand it. And then the middle part of the book really gets into, say, the poverty industry. And it's like an understanding of this system of profit between like the government and the nonprofits and the power structure there, and kind of like why that all exists to essentially perpetuate poverty. And then the third part is really focused on basic income and like the history, and you get into that more. And so it's just that structure too just works really well to better understand the importance of basic income. Because again, it's not a book about basic income, but once you read it, then you're like, okay, this is a really important idea. I get it now.
We were just talking about Martin Luther King a little while ago, just before we came on to this, and I forget which one of you was mentioning Martin Luther King and guaranteed income, but I told you that it was the welfare mothers who introduced Martin Luther King to guaranteed income. It was not Martin Luther King who brought it to the world. It was welfare mothers. And they refused to join him in the Poor People's March that was hopefully being planned in his mind, until he learned about guaranteed income and swore in a stack of Bibles that he supported it.
Yeah,
so
that's fascinating.
That little piece of history.
Yeah, it really does. That it reminds me of the people's history of the United States, and how like our history is written around these like single people, and of course mostly men usually, but it's like these single figures of history that are responsible for these big ideas. But really, I mean, these are movements behind these people, and you remember it because of the people at the top of these movements, but you don't know about all the things like that, where like a bunch of people get together and inject something in and make these changes, and then we just kind of remember what the changes were.
Well, national welfare rights at the time was, and subsequently for decades until now, was the only people's movement that ever looked at guaranteed income, and it was the primary motivation of the national organization almost immediately. And it came to me that way also. I mean, I was a little later than that, but I did meet most of the women of the National Welfare Rights Organization before most of them died. And it was overwhelming how important I thought it was when they talked to me about it. And I adopted it for sure.
Yeah.
Zach
he said that's a cool fact about the MLK thing. Yeah, we thought so too. And we were like, you have to bring that up. That is such a cool fact.
I thought it was funny that you thought it was so cool. So I raised it again. The thing, I don't know if you want me to stop talking, but
no, go ahead.
Never.
One of the things that concerns me, not that it didn't then, but that I'm consistently disturbed by in the subsequent conversations about basic income, which I participated in Europe for a couple of years, and realized was a pointless effort, because the peoples who've designed the current structures of the basic income are all males, almost entirely, although there are some women who've tried and are trying to get at the subject in a different way. If, for instance, you just take Andrew Yang's version, which, as I understand it, was so much for each adult and nothing for the children.
Yeah.
$1,000 a month, I think, for each adult. Is that correct?
Correct.
So to do it that way, a given 3-person family, a mother, a father, and one child, would end up with $24,000 a year, which places that 3-person family at just about the poverty level. If a mother and 2 children, which is a 3-person unit, by all poverty line estimates are based on various family units.
Yeah.
The same 3-person family unit would be getting $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year for all 3 of them. That puts her at half the poverty line with her kids, and that doesn't make any sense to me. You can't live reasonably well if you're halfway below the poverty line, and that sort of thing needs to be addressed. And while we tried to raise it when we were in Europe, they just wouldn't let us butt in, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It was as if they had said it and that was going to be that, and forget about talking about it further. But some of us, other women around Europe and here, had decided to look at it differently, and looked at it from a perspective of either you had to have the same amount per child as you give to each adult in order to have a fair system. And I throw in the 3, what I call the 3 frat boys. Each of the 3 frat boys gets $1,000 a month. So that 3-person unit gets $36,000 a year. How do you justify that? You can't. So we either think of a higher child, well, actually, I think both a child amount, and instead of looking at it from the perspective of one adult, well, the father, say, he maybe has a paying job, and the mother may not. Let's say it's that kind of family. And she works at home. Her value is every bit as much as his, even by your current standards. But the welfare mother and the married mother are both working their butts off. And nobody is assigning a value to that. And there's no particular reason why we don't assign a value to that and, and therefore compensate for the absence of wage or income that ascribes to the people who do most of the caring work of the world, not just this nation. So you could have a situation where the father is the non-caregiving parent is counted at one level, and the caregiving parent is counted at a higher level, and the children count. So therefore, both the mother who's married and the mother who's not, if they're not in the marketplace, still get don't have to surrender their humanhood by saying I'm not worth anything.
Throughout Yang's campaign, that was the one thing. So I was asked over and over, if you were to change one part of Yang's platform, what would it be? And I was always saying, look, the thing that I think is the most important is to add a child component to the freedom dividend. And that's so you can either do a freedom dividend that also counts kids, or you can add to your platform to have, say, refundable child tax credit or something that effectively does that you necessarily don't call a freedom dividend, but it's still counting and making sure that children get that money too. Because again, that is so important. And it's like, you can look at it too, where like it was great how Yang on the campaign trail would be talking about the importance of his wife's work at home with his kids, with their kids. And it's like, if you recognize that, then too, that let's say you're doing more work if, let's say, you're raising 2 kids instead of 1. And so it's like, do you think that $1,000 a month, no matter how many kids, recognizes the labor being done that's unpaid, by your partner at home? And it's not. So if you have a per child amount, then you also are recognizing that the more children, the more work that there is being done as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to hear that, because it's not even something I had really thought of.
I think women should think more about that. You have kids, believe me, 90% of all women have kids.
I think
I'll be in that 10%. I'll stick with my dogs.
You're the 10%?
Yeah.
I think so. Lots of women thought so back in the day.
I think you had a question. You want to throw that?
Yes, I did. I wanted to ask this question because someone did want to ask Teresa a question. Diane said, could Teresa please say something about the campaign to raise the welfare grant? And she meant in NYS that you led.
Well, I don't know exactly what you mean. If she's referring to the original campaign, must be.
Yeah, I think.
Well, the thing, everyone told us what we needed when I first started working with these group of welfare mothers, and no one knew what we thought we needed, and no one cared. So we were always being told, you can organize for this, you can try to do that, and then we kept saying, no, what we need is more money. So we set out to do a campaign to raise welfare benefits, which everyone told us we could not possibly succeed at doing because no one wanted to give any more money to welfare mothers and so on and so forth. We started a campaign, independent of all well-wishers. But it took us 3 years of organizing and demonstrations and chasing the governor around the state, which was quite fun. And in fact, one of the things we did is toward the end of the 3rd year, we introduced a campaign against welfare for the rich. And guess who was on the top of our list? Donald Trump owns the Hyatt. People had to buy it. That was literally the slogan that we regularly repeated in front of his hotel. But anyway, finally, after went through all manner of organizational groups that we got everyone on board, including women's groups and union groups and government politicians even, to say we needed a welfare grant increase, and we did win one. It wasn't much, but it was a hell of a lot more than we had before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite parts in the book were just seeing you cause trouble and
actually the most fun in general.
and your walks and all these things that you know, at the time, like, there was no social media, like hearing about how like you would do stuff and it wouldn't get covered, and like it's interesting now to think now, like the internet makes those things, especially with, you know, Black Lives Matter movement just recently, and to put yourself in that headspace of fighting for change in that scenario, where it's like you don't know if you're going to be shouting against a brick wall. You know,
most people are, no matter what. I mean, you will be, even in this media.
Yeah, I think we feel like so much is happening, but we only see a tiny sliver of it.
Hi, Erica.
Hi.
Erica has just recently announced she's running for Congress.
Wow, cool.
Yep.
Guaranteed income in the platform?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure is. She was our A+ canvasser in LA for Andrew Yang, but mostly speaking with local business owners on the topic of
UBI. Yeah, she talks to them a lot about that. Yeah, and she's also a teacher, so that's cool too.
Yeah,
there's more of those.
You know, Diane's question reminds me of another thing to ask you too, Teresa, to just speak about for a bit is I think a lot of people, again, this goes into like how welfare used to be and how it's changed and how it can even be worse now. And so one of those things is that we used to have something called like welfare hotels, and then it became like the shelter system. And then you got into like it's crazy to get into the details of the shelter system and how like there's basically, you know, less caring about like the you know, the conditions of the housing than there are like in prison. Absolutely. And like you can shove people together more, and you know that it's also I can't remember which person it was that was involved with this. It was one of the Cuomos, I think.
Yes.
And like,
Governor Cuomo here.
Yeah. And so could you speak a little bit so people can understand like what the old system was and what the shelter system like became?
Well, there were welfare hotels, and they existed because people got burnt out all the time. You know, fires in the poor neighborhoods, like, and so when that happened, you had to go they had to put them somewhere. So they put these families up in what were then called welfare hotels, which at least had little kitchenettes and things like that. They were small spaces, but with not only this issue, but the food pantry system. My God, don't get me going.
I want to get into that too.
Yes, we have to get into that because oh my God.
They know how to solve it. Who doesn't know anything about it? It's stunning, especially when it comes to poor people, because poor people aren't allowed to speak. That no one ever asks them what they think or what their conditions are or anything. So they come up with an idea. In this case, some lawyer who preceded Andrew did put a lawsuit together that said you had a right to shelter. We already knew that existed already. But what happened as a consequence is our current Governor Cuomo's father became governor, and he put money into the system, and his son took the money out of the system, and among others, many others, the Red Cross, you name the entity, and they made a shelter, and from which they gained huge sums of money, and poor people were left with stuff that was not even as big as the legal restriction for prison cells. They are half the size per person, that you can't even put a person in jail with that kind of space requirement. It's insane.
Yeah, and it costs more. It costs more to do that. So much more.
It was astronomical, which no one knew until we could read those proposals and find out what they were proposing and understand the revenue streams in the government.
Yeah.
Which you had to understand in order to come to those conclusions. It happens that there's so much crud behind the poverty system that unless you've been almost all the places I've been, you will always be at a loss to figure out what's going on, whether it's somebody who thinks you have too many babies when you're a teenager, or some, even though teenage baby having was going down for all that period of time, everybody kept calling it teenagers, women having babies, or teenagers having babies. Nobody noticing, by the way, that the teenagers who had babies were mostly impregnated by adult men. That's not even the issue.
Yeah.
But it was one thing after another, and every time there was a group of people who thought they knew what to do about it and found a way to get themselves money.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. That there's so much of reaching your hands in and making sure that you get paid, and it's an exchange of favors. And so that's you could tell that was like part of the Cuomo kind of move, and it worked for that family quite well to gain power politically through these exchanges of favors. And I think you described that well too, is kind of like showing, like putting an hourglass or putting a magnifying glass on this system to understand, like even like back in the history under Nixon, that like one of the reasons why LBJ didn't go about this was because it was like this political decision of if we give cash to people, then that's less power that I have to determine where this goes. And so if I get to choose where the money goes and hand it out to people to hand out, then I can control those people, and it's good for me politically. And so there was this choice on the Democratic side with LBJ thinking, no, we want to increase our power and not decrease it. And then Nixon comes in and he's like, he sees it from his perspective going, wait a second, the Democrats have power through the ability to make these changes. So let's actually give power to the people. And so that was his thinking.
So he went for guaranteed income.
Yeah.
Diane brings up something that Kateri and I were saying earlier. She said, we need Teresa in the movement, so we have your institutional knowledge and wisdom. And, Kateri and I, part of, one of the reasons we were excited about this book is because we were saying, Scott's a big name in the UBI movement. And of course, Andrew Yang has become a big name, MLK, all that. And we were like, but Teresa should also be a big name. People should know you. People should know.
Absolutely.
Like, what you've done, you know what I mean? And there's not enough women, I think.
Not enough at all.
I was trying to think, and I was like, I think you're the only one.
I know of.
Yeah. Giselle, but that Giselle Huff, but that's
nice.
Two people.
I like seeing more women in this movement. I really do. I think it's absolutely important. And for a lot of reasons, including that at some point, I think to understand this issue of unpaid, what was that?
Erica fangirling over Scott for a second.
The issue of unpaid labor and what effect it's had on the wages of women today. Because if you have no value and when you're not in the marketplace, you are worth nothing when you go and sell your labor. So that creates the conditions for women's wages to be lower than men's wages. And even though younger women, single women, enter the marketplace today at a fairly reasonable position, that is, your age group, the males and the females who have no children, are not terribly different in wages. But as soon as you have a child, all that changes. Even today, you'd find that in family units where both the father and the mother have full-time wage, year-round wage work, the father's income is not 59. The mother's income, I should say, is 41% of the father's. It's far worse than the generalized statistic will tell you, which is because it doesn't account for what happens when you have a child. Mm-hmm. The regular numbers that people throw out is like 59 cents to the dollar used to be when I was young. Probably it's more like 81 cents to the dollar today. That's the claim of what women make and men make. But even in the highest professions, women make much less than men do. And that's because when you don't work, when you're not worth anything in the home, when no value is assigned to you, you will always be worth less in the marketplace over time.
Right.
Yeah, I like this from for anyone who has the book, page 309, where you included a quote from Marilyn Waring's "If Women Counted." Mm-hmm. And like this gets right into it. So just to quote it, the public policy implications of imputing women's work into the national accounts are vast. First, per capita GDP would change markedly. A more reliable indicator of the well-being of the community would be available because all caring services, subsistence production, and that vast range of life-enhancing work would be visible and counted. And priorities would change. Unpaid workers could make a realistic claim on the public purse as opposed to being condemned to welfare. And so, yeah, I think it really is like kind of a core miscalculation of this exclusion of unpaid work from the GDP, because it doesn't like. It doesn't just undervalue it. It actually like really changes a lot of other things. And I like how you connect that to women's labor, and you get really to get people to think like, look, these things are connected, that because we do not count unpaid work in GDP, that is entirely connected to the fact that women are paid less than men when it comes to paid work.
Absolutely. Yep. And it's amazing, some countries are doing that now, and the numbers are just stunning of the amount of value that women's unpaid labor puts into every society. And of course, you can get rid of men all you like. You can't have babies without women.
And could you get into a little bit with the food program stuff, because again, like that's a key understanding of the fact that we're like basically we're paying to collect and distribute the garbage of corporations who like obviously it has no value if they can't sell it, but then we're paying them for it and our taxes pay for it.
You know what? I was thinking about that even a little earlier today. About how in poor communities, normally there are even men who help distribute resources. They might have gathered them back in the day from the garbage bin of the grocery store, as I did, or some other way, nobody knew, but they would show up and people could get cheap or almost free clothing, food, etc. Now, all that's locked up. Nobody can get any of it because the corporations finally realized that they could make money off their garbage. And that's how we set up this whole soup kitchen, food pantry network that's massive, that takes up billions of dollars in resources that could have been distributed to poor people, that ridiculously cost much more than anything that a reasonable person would pay at a grocery store, say, for a head of lettuce.
I like your lettuce example was great in the book, where you basically are like, okay, so here's what a head of lettuce costs originally, what it would be, but then effectively when you get a head of lettuce from, say, a food bank, after it's gone through this journey of like going through like second harvest to being sold to a local food bank network to like the food bank itself, and like eventually you're getting like a $4 head of lettuce that you have gotten for $1. But even though you're getting it for free, it still has the cost, but the cost is basically being borne by taxpayers, even though it's free at the end of sale. It's just a complete waste, and it's all profiting for these nonprofits along the way. Yeah,
it doesn't just get there fresh off the farm. Yeah,
I guess I want to going from there. Like, I want to get to like who your intended audience was when you wrote this book. Like when you were writing it, who are you hoping would read it?
Well, I figured all the welfare mothers I knew would read it, and they did. But I wanted, by that time I had a little bit of, what is it? Some policymakers knew who I was. Certainly in the social welfare world, everybody knew who I was. And so I knew they would read it, even though I wouldn't like what they read. And I thought maybe someday it would live, and it suddenly has. With you all.
It's great. It's an honor. But yeah, I mean, my kind of thinking was like, even though the subtitle of this book is Dismantling the Welfare System. So, I've shown this to some people I know who are more like on the Republican side, who do want to see,
yes, I know.
for different reasons, probably.
But they don't want to put anything in its place. They just want to get rid of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But as I was reading it, I really had this sense that it was, you talk about like the liberal do-gooders. And so, and about how so much of people you criticize are people on the left or progressives. Or,
the Democratic Party.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of my takeaway. I felt like you were
the ones who finally said we've had enough of her.
Yeah. So I found that really interesting. I feel like, there's so much of you talk about, like the marketing homeless people and marketing poor people. And so as someone who kind of up until very recently has been on the other side and just kind of is exposed to that, and that's kind of it. And then now this is something that I care really deeply about. Like I'm constantly asking myself, like, how do I get more people to care? Like I suddenly come to care. And I don't think I have an answer to that, but I think I want to say like what helps is when people know that there's actually some sort of answer, and that's what guaranteed income.
Well, you're on the path for sure of doing something about it right now.
Yeah.
As long as you keep on doing, you've got lots of years ahead of you. It won't always be fun, but it would be very productive.
Yeah, I know you can speak to, staying in the game and fighting the good fight. Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to, kind of on that note though, one of the things we just want to talk about is like the idea of cruelty. Because I think or at least the first two sections in particular, explore that concept in so many different ways, like from the welfare office itself to what's done in the home. But these women are on their own, but still it's absolutely like cruelty that's systemic, that extends to the home, to from the very top. From these politicians, from these people on these boards. And it's just so interesting because it's all this like no one's thinking they're being cruel, but yet it's this cesspool of cruelty that's just perpetuated, and no one questions it.
They're not, but I'm not convinced that they are just dupes. They're not dupes.
Right.
I spent a lot of time. The foundations, the staff of foundations, even if they wanted to give me money, couldn't give me money because the people whose money it was didn't want to hear it. They just wanted to, they wanted the system to remain as it was. And if you didn't know, you wouldn't care. And that's why they participated as often as not. Why the corporations participated probably wasn't as much out of cruelty as it was just, let's make another buck.
Right.
And we made bucks off it, and now we pay for it in the tax burden and the burden to dump their garbage when it turns out to be actual garbage. It's now in local landfills. They used to have to throw it away. So some people don't know anything. And actually, the last younger people I met when I stopped doing this were awful. They didn't know, but they had bought into all of what the people who were getting the contracts for this, that, and the other, and they didn't want to hear from anything other than that. And I just didn't bother. It was a waste of my time. I've been doing it for too long.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the fact that there is a movement for guaranteed income or basic income is stunning to me at this point. I'm really pleased.
That's nice. That makes me happy to hear. Yeah, because that was the reason I was talking to Kateri about the cruelty beforehand, because that's, I think, one of the things that really stuck out to me the most in this book. The first two parts was just that the cruelty for no reason, almost during some of it, like treating people like they're not people, like they're not human beings.
Oh, right, that.
There was one story, I think it was in the story of the lady who the worker watched her use the red pen, and I literally I actually started crying, frustrated tears myself, just reading the story, because I was, and for those of you, and for those of you who didn't read it, what happened was this lady was filling out one of the forms, and it said you had to use blue or black ink, but they wouldn't give her a pen. And so she started using red ink, and then they gave her a pen. We're like, no, you can't use it. And she had literally just made the first part of the M in her name or something like that.
One letter, not even a letter.
Not even the full letter.
Not even a letter.
Yes, just a line. And they watched her refill out the whole application, and she goes to turn it in, and the lady was like, there's a red line on this. You have to do this whole thing over again. Even though the lady had watched her use that red pen for that one line and could have just told her as soon as or not even just told her, just handed her another paper. It takes half a second to hand her. And I was like, that is cruelty.
That wasn't a real rule. That was that lady's rule that day.
That's
capriciousness of the system. All these people make up rules as they go along. It is their job to determine who gets welfare and who doesn't, but they're the intake people. And what I think is most important about that is it's virtually impossible for me to explain how painful it is, because you're there with your child or your children, and you have nothing for them. And you
have to be there by 8 a.m.
Right? Yeah. And the sign on the wall says, no matter what time your appointment is, if you are not here by 8 a.m., you will not be seen. What? Yeah. You have an appointment for 1 o'clock. You get there at 1 o'clock, and then you have to come back the next day because you didn't know that if you had an appointment, you wouldn't be seen if you didn't get there at 8 o'clock.
Yes. And at the same time, they're telling you, you need to get a job. How am I supposed to get a job and work if I have to be here all day? That doesn't.
It's a question of childcare, by the way.
That too. Yeah.
You can't dump your children and go to take a job, a paying job.
One of my favorite examples from the book too is when this was basically along the kind of job training examples, and so a woman was instructed to go through a phone book and one at a time. Yeah. And basically cold call each of these to see if they had a job opening available. Yes. And so she thought that was absurd. And so she went home that day, and then she went into the classifieds, and she found a bunch of jobs that, that could work. She comes back and she's thinking that, oh, this will make so much more sense, that, I've improved this. I'll be more likely to find a job doing it this way. And the person is no, you don't get it. The entire point of this is to show that you will do stuff that doesn't make any sense, because that makes you a good worker.
Yes. Yes. And along with that one was when they were basically having a class teaching you how to take sexual harassment and not say anything about it, just take it, because that's what you do to keep a job, and you need to do anything they tell you to, or anything you can to teach a job. So instead of like teaching you how to, like, you know, how jobs nowadays, there are like, oh, here's how to report sexual harassment. They were teaching women how to take it.
How to accept it.
Yes. Here's how to accept it.
What
and
you
it's like,
do if you want to have a job.
Yes. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is, you know, it's, but to them, it's like, well, no, so if you're less than human, then of course you're going to take this abuse, right? Because if you don't count as a person, then it's not really abuse, you know. But it's like people wouldn't even treat their dogs like that, right? So it's like,
right, and the only value you have is as a paid worker. Like unless you were doing a job, you are worthless. And so if you're looking at it from that perspective, then yeah, you should do anything you're asked, anything at all, accept any conditions, whatever. Just make sure you get a job, because then the taxpayer isn't paying for you, and then you are a person because you have a job. And it's like that's the kind of thing. It really frustrates me. And again, Teresa mentioned it as being like you described it as the male model of poverty too. How, like, you know, it's only women are not begging for more work. You know, if you're a single mother at home, you know, you're not begging for work. You're busy. You've got a lot of valuable work. You want to be compensated. You're looking for, you need income. It's not that you're looking for a job. It's men who are saying that women need to get a job.
That's right. That's right. It's always been that way too.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, this kind of segues actually perfectly into a question that somebody had for you, Teresa. Diane was saying, can you explain your position on a federal jobs guarantee versus guaranteed/universal income? Because I think that the debate needs more nuance than it has now.
Well, I think the federal job guarantee is foolish. I think given the developments in the labor market, which seem to be advantaged certainly more highly skilled people, and the disadvantaged is almost all mother replacement jobs, as I see them. Even if you could get one, it atomizes. I don't know if this makes any sense. Your work is atomized. Instead of being a person who washes your children, cooks for your children, shops for your children, makes them do their homework, stays up with them all night when they're sick. Instead of doing that, you're going to watch someone else's children for 8 hours a day, but your child is left with God knows what. And most women don't feel like they could pay someone to replace them. And so even if you thought it was possible, it's an absurd idea, because there's no one there who's going to take care of your child. Women nonetheless do enter and exit the labor market as their families need. So no one stays home to stay home and watch TV. People enter and exit as their families need them to. And say the kids go to school, then they go too. They go to work for those number of hours a day or whatever.
Yeah,
got off the track of what you were interested in talking about.
I think the idea of women's work is something that we need to be talking about more. I feel like, I mean, there's obviously like more recently been a more like feminist push towards like freeing women from that idea. But it's like, well, we need to, women are going to continue to have children. Like,
women are my kids, I want you to know. But, and have always been. Gloria Steinem was a friend of mine. But she and I do not agree on that subject.
Well, can I just chime in too? This job guarantee thing, I could go off forever about why I dislike the job guarantee. But when it comes to, let's talk about the unpaid labor at home. I know that sub-job guarantee advocates will say, oh, well, we recognize that is work, and so we want to pay moms to do that. That will be a guaranteed job. What'll happen is like your local community will be able to recognize that job, and you'll go there and say, hey, I'm doing this. And then they'll say, okay, here, and you get your money. And it's like, let's just kind of peel those layers back a little bit, just from a realistic perspective. So let's assume that works, and let's say, let's not say we're not ignoring everybody. Let's say everyone who's an unpaid mom at home is recognized, and that counts as a job guarantee. Okay, so what are we going to do? Are they going to like clock in? Are they going to, we're going to say that like, okay, you have to work this many minimum of hours in order to get this. And if you're not, like, there's different amounts of work. So let's say someone is doing, full time, and maybe someone's like a parent on the weekends or something. And so do they get paid like 3 times as much because they're doing 3 times as work? So then are we doing this by the hour? And then like, are we like, how are we counting that? And so like you get into, how do you like the realistic like details involved in going about a job guarantee? It's like as soon as you start getting into those details, it makes less and less sense. And it just, to me, it just seems that people are just kind of magical thing. Let's just give people money for this work, and not even like digging into what that means. And I think that it's kind of silly especially when you look at unpaid work of like moms, especially.
When men work as many hours as women do, they can tell us about it. But that has never happened.
Yeah.
Well, even when it's hard, they don't have to work through the night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, you actually do kind of touch on this, in the third part of your book. You say it's on page 319 for anybody who has the book with them. But you say, whereas some new jobs would be created in a guaranteed income economy, it is essential to acknowledge that it is highly unlikely that there will ever be enough decent jobs for everyone. And I think that's a really good point to make, right? And I think especially when you're bringing automation into the conversation as well.
That's exactly right.
Even if everybody had a job, I mean, if you wanted to, like you just cannot guarantee that. You can say you're going to guarantee it, but you can't. And I don't.
I'm sorry. I thought
you're fine.
Now there are so many ways for wealth that to be produced through the air, is what I call it, computerized, this, that, and the other. That no one except a handful of people get wealth from. It's amazing to me that isn't taxed in some fashion. Which would easily fund any level of guaranteed income you could possibly reasonably expect.
I want to point out too to readers and everyone who hasn't read this too that let's say, I mean, Teresa was really ahead of this as far as looking at me or Andrew Yang or anybody, and like there's even automation in this book, and so I just want to quote. She gets in a little bit, and she even includes this thing called the Triple Revolution memo on Cybernation. So I think it's important. I'm just going to read it really quick because it's such a good summary. So it says, in the developing cybernetic system, potentially unlimited output can be achieved by systems of machines which will require little cooperation from human beings. The continuance of the income through jobs link to consume now acts as the main brake on the almost unlimited capacity of a cybernetic productive system. An adequate distribution of the potential abundance of goods and services will be achieved only when it is understood that the major economic problem is not how to increase production, but how to distribute the abundance that is the great potential of cybernation. Wealth produced by machines rather than men is still wealth. We urge, therefore, that society, through its appropriate legal and governmental institutions, undertake an unqualified commitment to provide every individual and every family with an adequate income as a matter of right.
Yeah. The Triple Revolution is one of my all-time favorite pamphlets.
It's great.
It was. That's where the welfare mothers learned about guaranteed income.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so Martin Luther King also discussed like the automation in his book, and is that also came from the welfare mothers too? From
yes, they did.
This, yeah.
I mean, I wasn't one of them, but I know the story. And they definitely hit. He was stunned. They went right at him with all of that. He accepted it nonetheless. Women.
Freaking girl power.
I was pretty young.
Well, can we just touch a little bit too here on, let's connect this to what we're seeing right now. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're in the what seems to be the beginning of the next depression, and it's just, I mean, there's always been a need for unconditional basic income. We're seeing this even more right now, and like what are you thinking, like, as you were watching this take place and seeing this new depression happen, seeing like just the mess involved of you know, the unemployment system, and you know, like Florida is a great example of just how many people are being left out of these checks that are supposed to be provided to people, and the fact that, you know, people are doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do because they feel they absolutely, you know, need to, and the fact that we're entering into another depression where people don't have the spending money, and this spiral that will come out of that. Like, what do you think that after, you know, everything you've seen, what do you think about this history now? Well,
I think this may be the time that you can actually move a political agenda for a guaranteed income. When I think about what's going on now, I realize how many people are having to go to the welfare department to get help, and nobody's at the welfare department to give them help. Right. And I just can't fathom what it must be, the red tape that people are going to must go through just to get what is not even a subsistence level of living. So, but on the other side of that coin, what I always have been, and not just at this time, disturbed by, is the sense that the broader community of people feel so badly about the newly poor, that's willing to give them much more. And that may be, you know, what we have to do. How do you go about achieving a guaranteed income? But it's stunning. You know, they put those checks together and they mailed them more than the employment checks, which are much larger than any welfare checks, and on and on. And yet at the same time, these people are living in a world of terror. They've lost their source of income, and they don't know if they're ever going to get it back.
Yeah, I think along those lines, the existence of the pandemic unemployment assistance program, which for people who don't know, that was the kind of added on component, recognizing that there's a lot of people in the gig labor, alternative work kind of arrangements, freelancers that are left out of the existing unemployment system. So Congress said, oh, let's make this other new system that people can apply for to get that assistance, because they usually wouldn't get any. And so it's like, great.
They're in the gig economy, but they aren't getting.
Yeah, like all of a sudden they recognize that and go, oh, it's because, you know, they haven't been getting anything. We need to make sure they did something. And they didn't care at all for, you know, the decades since that's been growing. Like all net new employment this century essentially has been in this alternative work sector. Right. And so work has been becoming increasingly you know, absent of having this any kind of safety net, and just this increasing the precarious existence. And it took this for Congress to be like, let's actually do something new for them. Right. So yeah,
and that creates political opportunity.
Right.
And that's what's important about this today.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful in a certain way, because conditions are ripe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw an email sent out, I think, on your newsletter about some students who were doing debating on universal basic income. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. So this is I found out this for the first time when I was in Iowa. And it was so funny. One of the Yang gang there, who was on the ground in Iowa, they told me he had realized that. So he was in like the high school debate club, and he had done a lot of debating, and basic income became a topic that he got involved in. And he found this source that, like, once he started using that source's stuff, then he was able to, like, win all these debates. And so then he realized that that source was me. And so he was like, just thank you for winning all my debates. And it's like, look, you, like, a lot of people know who you are in the debate world. And I was like, I never heard about this. And then I started hearing about it more from other people independently, where apparently basic income has become like a major topic in especially in high school, in the high school debate world. And it's like a favorite topic for the people in high school. It's not like it's being handed down. It's like they're choosing, like they really want to debate this.
Well,
And
debating it.
What's that?
I hope some female children are debating it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I would think so. I don't know what the demographics of the debate teams are, but
it will be presented to them the way it is always presented, and they won't even know that there's an issue there, which is too bad. Which you women,
we'll just have to
know about.
Yes.
After they are, as well as this book.
Yes.
Anyway, that was uplifting. I read that and I was like, that is really cool to like think that the youth are really passionate. You know, Andrew Yang won the youth straw poll in Iowa, and all that stuff is like, you know, we can't see the benefits of it yet, but it's very heartening to hear.
Yeah, and it's also heartening. There's been like global surveys done too of basic income, and it's really interesting to see that across country, like country after country after country, it's the youth that like the idea the best. So it just seems like it's one of those topics that, as that group ages, then it's going to be like, we should have a basic income. Why don't we have this already?
Right.
It definitely seems like something that is going to happen at some point. The question is, how soon can we make it happen?
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's exactly.
And I think that'd be a great jumping off point to kind of have a quick discussion about your readings, specifically, Scott, that we, especially you chose from your article, From Rats in Cages to Primates in Paradise. And I want to ask specifically, like, why out of all of your articles was this one the one that you wanted us to read? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, and then also give a brief overview for anyone.
So from my perspective, so I was actually like an engineering and physics major originally, and then I changed to psychology. And so I'm really interested in kind of like neuroscience and the way like we think, like why we think what we think, like the effects of human behavior. And so it like from a like basic income as an idea, even when I started to learn about it, I was really interested in the experimental evidence and to see like how people behave when they receive this. And so in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, why? Like, so you can kind of just like, make assumptions about, it's common sense that you do this, like, oh, you eat better, you use it to start businesses, and, let's say alcohol consumption goes down, drug use goes down, and like, but why? And so that's what I was really curious about when I did that article. I was exploring kind of like what's going on in your body that's responsible for this. So I want people to think like, people behave the way that they behave. A lot of it is because of our environment. And if you're in a stressed out environment full of insecurity, and what do? Well, as human mammals, we have, in order to reduce our stress, and this is a physiological response from like the stressors in your body, and you want to reduce those. And so like you pull levers of control, and a lever of control is our hierarchy. And so if you're in a hierarchy, and there's all sorts of different hierarchies you can be in, but so let's say you're at work, you're like at the bottom part, and so the shit rolls downhill, and like your life is miserable at work, and you go home, and then you're at the top of your hierarchy at home. Let's say you have your wife and kids, and you decide to, hey, maybe if I beat my wife, then that'll make me feel better. It'll make me feel like I'm in control. And so that's what, like, this bullying behavior, this kind of xenophobia, even like racism, like a lot of the stuff can come from the fact that you're trying to gain some kind of sense of control in your life. And that's also like, religion is another means of control. And like smoking and drinking and drugs, like these are ways of kind of reducing the stress and feeling that you're in control of something, if even like that kind of thing. And there's just so much of what's messed up in our society is the result of this chronic economic insecurity, this and it goes back to like our fight or flight response. And that's this is, as we had this evolutionary, this kind of superpower where we could, if we had like stressed out, then suddenly we could sprint, we could think faster, and like there was a use for that. But nowadays it's not adaptive. If we are stressed out, then we're thinking about only our bills, and we're not thinking about, say, climate change and stuff. And if we're stressed out, then we're like hating each other, we're being violent to each other, we're abusing each other, because of this, trying to avoid the stress response. So like I wanted people to get into kind of like the physiological kind of basis of why basic income works and why it's important to make sure that people have the security. And if they have that security, then they don't do all these like negative things that are bad for themselves, bad for the people that they love, and bad for society as a whole. And that we could do this like rat park, which I also described in there. For people who haven't heard of this, it's it's a very commonly known kind of experiment where like, oh, you stick a rat in a cage and you give it drugs, and it'll just use the drugs until it's dead. And what people don't understand, but someone did figure out, is that a lot of this is the isolation of the cage. And so if you're isolated from everybody else and you're alone in a cage, then drugs make a heck of a lot more sense because you're miserable. But if you create an environment where you're surrounded by friends and family, and there's plenty of food, and there's toys, and there's a whole society around you, that suddenly you don't want that. The rat park experiment showed that if you create a rich environment, then the rodents actually will choose not to actually have to ingest the drug. And they even that they're not actually wanting the drug, because what they did is, even to double test that, was that they added something that negates the kind of effect of it and like the taste. So if it negated the effect, then they would have it, and but otherwise they wouldn't. So like it wasn't the only reason they were doing that. They were specifically avoiding that kind of drunken, kind of drugged effect of it. They much preferred not having that, as long as they had this happy environment around them. So yeah, let's create an environment where we are happier, where there's less stress and there's more resources and we're more together. Because again, that's a key component too, is you can have a really stressed out, horrible like environment, but for some reason, if you have like a strong community, if you have a strong family and friends, then you can that'll negate those effects. So it really is important. And it's interesting too, like right where we are now, there's so much social isolation going on. It's like the worst possible thing you can be doing to actually isolate everyone from each other. Things will only get worse because of that, because like it really is like a key factor for our own like mental health, is to have each other. Yeah. So it's even like that much more important now.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you like this article?
What's up?
Read it.
Oh, she wants to read it.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we can link them.
Yeah, those will be. They're probably in the links of the YouTube description already, but I'll email you the links
yeah,
too.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can. Yeah, and on our Twitter page for everybody in the chat, they are in our pinned tweet. If you wanted to look at those.
What did you say? That?
The pinned tweet at the top of our page.
I don't see.
We'll send them to you, Teresa. Don't worry.
Yeah, we'll send it to you.
Yeah.
We have a question for Scott.
Yeah, I'd like to know the answer to
that. Yeah. So my story is that I guess my main kind of discovery of it was through actually a book, and it was Mana by Marshall Brain. And this was a science fiction novella. It's on the shorter side, but I read that in 2013. It was recommended on Reddit as being like something in this discussion about like how quickly technology is advancing, and no one is really talking about it or recognizing the impacts of that. People said, "Oh, you got to read Mana," and it was highly upvoted. So I was like, "Oh, well, I'll read Mana," and so Mana, like the first half of it, basically kind of imagines this world. It's entirely realistic take on things, where we just start automating stuff, and we actually start at like middle management and automate that first, and then it goes from there. But we basically the responses that we do to that are what you would expect our responses to be. So it went like, all right, let's make sure people have food and shelter, so they're unemployable. So we created like this whole mass of unemployable people, and so let's just like round them up and basically put them in camps because they're all useless, and just make sure that they're fed. Basically all in prison essentially. It's just like it's a mess, but it's realistic. It's very dystopian. And then the second half of the book was basically this visualizing of what if we made technology work for everybody? Like what if we made these changes where it was all about abundance instead of scarcity, in that we made sure that everybody was like much better off, because we were making sure that technology doesn't only flow to those at the very top, they're the owners that make sure that everyone benefits. And the author of that believed that the way really to get there was a basic income of he was talking about $25,000 a year, so like a bigger basic income. And I'd never really I'd actually read previously about it, and so it wasn't entirely unknown to me. But when I read it through that perspective, and I was like, all right, I got to read more about this. And so then that's when I went into learning about the history and experiments, and that was when like the rabbit hole opened up for me. So yeah, it was through that book.
Who wrote that book?
It was a Marshall Brain. He was the founder of How Stuff Works.
Oh, like Brain?
Yeah, Brain. Yeah.
Wow. Real life foreshadowing for himself.
Yeah.
Books, you guys. This is why we created the Ink and Book Club. Books open up a whole world that you never knew about. And look, if Scott had never read this book, we wouldn't have Scott here. Like, full circle. Full circle.
Yeah. I mean, books are extremely important. I've always been a huge fan of books, and I've read many, and they've just very influential. In fact, the way that I think about it too is that I think of myself as being like crowdsourced. Like everything that I know, not I didn't like invent it in my own brain. I read other people, and they read other people. Like I've seen stuff and they talked about things that they experienced or they learned from others. It's like all of civilization is this giant collective of sharing of information. And, books are just such a pivotal part of that we're able to convey like long form information to each other across the generations. And, I didn't invent any of this stuff. I didn't invent basic income, but I was able to, see that it made sense. And I read a bunch of other stuff that, made sense, and now I'm just trying to make sure that it makes sense to other people.
Yes.
You're doing a good job, Scott.
You are.
Thanks.
Well, we have a few questions for Teresa. So Diane said, Teresa, have you given any thought as to the current state of the presidential campaign and what needs to happen in presidential or congressional politics to save us from the situation?
Of course, I've given some thought to it, but I'm not about to give Biden any advice. Although he could use some.
And then Zach has a question I'm sure we're all curious about.
We need to talk about.
He said, what has Teresa been up to recently?
Well, I'm a grandma. I like it.
That's fun.
And I have a garden. So I try not to think about this stuff too much because it just upsets me. Although I have been excited this period of time since the Yang Gang just showed up.
Yay.
And Andrew Yang himself, not to mention.
You relax. We'll carry on the fight.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll keep reading and sharing your book. That's all.
Yes. And he also said, will she start being active on Twitter?
If I figure out how to use it, I may, but I haven't figured it out yet.
Okay.
I don't know why. It's just I'm not used to these newfangled things.
Twitter's hard for all of us. Trust me.
That's how I feel about TikTok, Teresa.
That's how I feel about
Change
TikTok.
all the time. I thought that I was going to be on Zoom here, and it's not even Zoom.
Yeah, I feel that Zoom has become the new generic for anything, that uses this kind of setup. And it's funny,
Oh,
like
like
it used to be
Google.
Skype. Yeah, and like then it's like Skype
Yeah,
became
right.
Zoom in this environment. Even like Zoom skipped ahead. Skype is now like nothing, and Zoom is what everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
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 Why do they change so much?
There's always something new.
Those
Yeah.
are
You
the
get bored.
better, shinier.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes, Diane brought up a good one. Did you all know that Teresa invented a comic book hero for unpaid caregiving?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that
Oh, you haven't seen my comic book. Too bad. I could show you. I could show you Carrie Giver. She's a woman who gives care.
Nice.
Well, she helps people all over the place, and she had a child, but her child died. But she saves kids in fires, out of fires, and does all kinds of manners of things, including trying to convince women that they have value when they're raising their children.
I think we need a motion to make her the official of the Yang Gang.
Yes.
If you're interested, I could probably send at least the two or three of you a copy of my Diane and I actually worked it out together.
Please.
Carrie Giver comic book. You want one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
Email me and I'll send you guys one.
We're I think Megan has to get going actually, and we are over an hour. This one by
Yes.
still that
I
workshop
know.
an hour and a half.
Almost. Yeah.
I have two questions for you, Teresa, like to close out. Well, the first one's from Megan, but I want to know too. What happened with DWAC? Like,
Yeah. I tried to look it up and I couldn't find it.
Well, you probably can't, although the bulk of DWAC's papers are in the New York State Library. You probably have to look up welfare or my name or something to look at, but all those papers exist in a way that you can easily access. I decided, I suppose, as much as anybody, that I didn't want the word welfare in the name anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we were moving toward another theory of what we should do. We started this other organization called Social Agenda, which meant nothing, and that was a good idea because words didn't bother anybody. Well, I mean, after DWAC, we had put together the Redistribute America movement. That was smart. So social agenda didn't mean anything, and that's what grew out of downtown welfare. You had to have a lot of money to do what DWAC did, and the more people knew about what we were trying to do, the less money we could raise, and that was really the death of it.
That's so interesting and sad. But
right, you were too
it
good
lives
at it.
on. What's that, Scott?
It's like, yeah, you were too good at it. Like you were doing the right thing, and people didn't want you doing the right thing.
No, they absolutely did not. I mean, the governor went to various funders and said, get rid of them. And it happened over time that we could raise money for absolutely nothing by the end. We raised money for a caregiver credit, a child tax credit after that. And we won at the federal level, which didn't exist before in that way. But it was torture. The Democrats were so opposed, and it looked like the Republicans were happy to do it, except they weren't interested in poor women getting the children of poor women to get any. And that's where we put our mark on it, to lower the floor under which so that you could get it even if you weren't employed. However, you had to have been employed at least 2 weeks to get something, but you couldn't get it all. It was mostly gone to more affluent families, and we were able to get it to at least millions more people got above the poverty line with that. It's been a series of campaigns, and then I stopped.
Yeah,
because it was not possible to do it with zero money.
Yeah, that's another interesting bit of history about that people don't necessarily know about it as far as the child tax credit goes, is that let's say that the Democrats were not behind that idea.
No.
Were able to make it happen, and it was, as it exists, it was partially refundable, and then it even became something that Republicans even were able to get on board. That's something that doubled in actually during Trump's administration, so that it was $1,000, now it's $2,000. And let's double it again, and let's make it fully refundable. And then, bam, we've got ourselves effectively a child allowance that both sides can agree on, hopefully.
Only if everyone can get it. It has to be 100% refundable.
Yeah, absolutely.
No one at the bottom will ever get it. And that's what we mostly worked on, making it fully refundable. And we did get it more refundable, but not all the way down.
Like, that's one of the things that bothered me, like when Kamala Harris came out with her LIFT Act, and it's like she used the EITC, which uses a slope so that if you're earning $0, then you get nothing from it, and then let's say if you earn $1, you get $1, and so it phases in, and it's like it's so annoying to me, this fascination with the phase in, especially among Democrats, where like, oh, you got to have that, and that really. That came in too, like under, Bill Clinton, and there's a lot of stuff that Clinton did that was really bad, and people don't understand that.
It was really terrible. I mean, right after it, when it went through, I was getting emails from women all over the country, and they were having a horrible time, including one woman wrote and said that she was forced to go to a pretend job. They weren't even real jobs. They were pretend. But she had no choice in order to keep getting her welfare check. And she had to find someone who would take care of her child while she was doing that. And there was no one to do that. So she finally got the child's father who wasn't interested in the family at all, but at least to take care of his kid while she had to do the job. Well, the father fell asleep on top of the child and killed it. And she will never be the same. And I would hear those stories over and over again because there was no provision for the alternative care of a child. And outside of that, and that system was simply and totally cruel. And I don't care who hears me say it. You shouldn't have done it. You really shouldn't have done it. Well, you can imagine the Clintons do not like me anymore.
Teresa is a unique person who has done way more for poor people and families than most politicians who have had far more money and power. Teresa, you are really a heroic person.
Agreed.
I agree.
Agreed.
Thank you
That's
so much.
really nice, Diane.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
So my final question is, I think, kind of a simple one, but I feel like it needs to be asked, and it kind of goes off what you were just talking about. Why did you name the book Tyranny of Kindness, like just in your own words?
Well, actually, originally I called it Fascism of Kindness, but my publisher wouldn't let me use that. So it was turned into the slightly less vicious tyranny. It's because of the whole idea that people will do business on behalf of poor people, pretending all along that they're helping when they're not, and sucking up, tax dollars left and right. And after welfare reform came with the Clintons, they got almost all the money, and that was disgusting. So I called it Tyranny of Kindness, because people shouldn't be doing things like that to other people, especially ones they don't know anything about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really kind.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You said it best yourself, and thank you so much for being here. We're just
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And
I appreciate it.
And thank you to Scott as well.
Yes.
Thank you for picking this book. I'm really, really glad that you picked this book.
Yeah, me too.
And to like a more recent book on, other books that I'm sure we'll read in the future. So, I think this was the right place to start. We're obviously going to continue looking more and more into universal basic income, and you are both welcome on the channel and on our page anytime. I think it would be really interesting to now do a more like contemporary like dive into like welfare today, like Teresa was saying. It's really just gotten worse. And bring people on who've been on welfare and like actually give or are on welfare, hear from them. So
that'll be a little more tricky because you don't know, you don't live with them, so you can't just get them to talk to you.
Yeah. So anyone
in the 60s, there you could have, but now not so much, unless you know how to traverse the very poor neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah. So anyone who knows anyone or has something that they think that they could add to the conversation, let us know. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Thanks, Manny, for hearing from all our reader friends.
Yes.
So just to do it really quickly, I don't have a ton of housekeeping. All the links, everything we mentioned will be in the links, and I'll add the one from Scott's book. And next month's book is This Is an Uprising by Mark and Phil Engler. So we wanted, this is specifically about movements. So I think this is a good
it's about building a movement. Yeah, and this one was suggested to us by another female champion of universal basic income, Giselle Huff. So she recommended this. So we're pretty excited, building a movement. That's what the Yin Gang is about, right? And that's what everybody should be about, is building a movement that actually gets shit done, you guys.
Even if it takes years.
Yeah, even if it takes years.
Right.
I'm going to say bye now.
All right.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Great conversation.
See you later. Thank
Bye.
you.
Whoops. I have to figure out how to make it stop.